Weary after years of warfare with France and increasingly aware that the struggle with the United States would not be easy, Britain agreed to discuss peace. On Christmas Eve, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent ended the war. Before the news of peace could reach North America, however, two more significant events occurred. The first was the defeat of the British invasion force at New Orleans by American forces under General Andrew Jackson. This victory cemented Jackson's heroic reputation and made him a rising star in American politics. The second event was the holding of the Hartford Convention in New England. This region was the nation's strongest bastion of federalism, and they had long been unhappy with the foreign policies of the Democratic Republicans. The embargoes and then the war itself had further frustrated New Englanders, who had long been heavily involved in overseas commerce. While there was some talk of actually seceding from the Union, ultimately they decided instead to issue a series of demands for constitutional changes, including requiring a two-thirds majority vote in Congress to declare war and a one-term limit on the presidency. None of their demands were actually enacted, and the convention, taking place at just the moment when the war was ending, helped put the final nail in the coffin of the Federalist Party. The United States emerged from the war a somewhat different nation. While not precisely a victory, Americans could certainly take pride in the fact that they had once again successfully held off the greatest military in Europe, and this time without any help from France. In the wake of the conflict, a great surge of patriotic pride and optimism swept the country. In the period following the war, the United States became more confident and assertive in its foreign policy. The British largely abandoned any ambitions they had to check the growth of the United States. The Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817 demilitarized the Great Lakes, and the following year the two countries agreed on the boundaries between Canada and the United States, with the question of the Oregon country to be determined at a later date. This ended American ambition to expand into Canada, but the U.S. did successfully annex Florida. For some time, the U.S. had been concerned by cross-border raids by the Seminole tribes, which included many African Americans who had escaped from slavery. In 1819, General Andrew Jackson launched an attack upon Spanish Florida, seeking to destroy their bases. His impetuous action sparked a diplomatic crisis, but rather than condemn his invasion, the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, used this as leverage to secure concessions from Spain, a European power which was facing huge problems trying to hold on to its American colonies. With the Adams-Onis or Transcontinental Treaty, the U.S. secured possession of Florida and an agreement on the boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase. By 1823, the Spanish Empire had largely collapsed, leading to the rise of a number of new nations in Latin America. When Spain threatened to create a European coalition to reclaim its possessions, the United States issued a strong warning, referred to as the Monroe Doctrine, which asserted that the United States would not tolerate any further European colonization of the Americas. The post-war era also saw important changes in American politics. The Federalist opposition to the war had hastened the demise of this party, and for a time the country had no clear party system. Historians refer to this period of muted partisanship as the era of good feelings. Yet, underneath, the policies and ideals of the Federalists did not vanish with the party. The Supreme Court, for instance, remained under the influence of John Marshall, a staunch Federalist who had been appointed by John Adams in 1800. Marshall, as Chief Justice, molded the court into a powerful branch of the government. One of the most important cases heard by the court was that of Marbury v. Madison in 1803. William Marbury had been appointed as a Justice of the Peace by the outgoing President, John Adams, but the documents were not delivered. The new Secretary of State, James Madison, refused to hand them over. The case went immediately to the Supreme Court, which had been granted original jurisdiction over writs of mandamus under the Judiciary Act of 1789. The case presented Marshall with a dilemma. If the court ordered the Jefferson administration to hand over the appointment, the president would almost certainly ignore the order, thus diminishing the authority of the court, whose status and role in the federal government was still evolving. Marshall's decision, supported unanimously by the court, was that Marbury was legally entitled to the appointment, but that the Judiciary Act of 1789, which gave the Supreme Court original jurisdiction, was unconstitutional, and thus the court had no standing to order the administration to comply. This ruling not only avoided a direct confrontation with the Democratic Republicans, but it also helped establish what became known as judicial review, the right of the Supreme Court to have the final say in whether a law was constitutional. Keep in mind that the Constitution was not really explicit on this point. Some argued that the President, who represented the entire nation, had this ultimate power. Others suggested that the power remained in the hands of the states. The Marshall Court also reinforced Hamilton's argument for a strong national government. In the case of McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819, the court essentially ruled that the Bank of the United States was constitutional, that Hamilton's argument that the national government had implied powers and was not limited only to powers explicitly described in the Constitution was correct. Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824 likewise reinforced national power by affirming the federal government's right to regulate interstate commerce.